Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. I'm not sure if you saw in the link that Amy sent that I asked if people could have a small sheet of paper during the sermon so that we could have a few minutes to write a few words down. So later on in the service, I'll be asking you to have a small piece of paper available to write a few things down. So I wanted to start off by talking about our small dog, Tucker. So this is the smallest dog that Craig and I have ever had. And we've noticed that he's much more skittish and nervous about new things than our previous dogs. So we find ourselves doing a lot of reassuring and practicing taking him on walks in new places so that he'll see he's okay. I was taking him for a walk the other morning in a part of the neighborhood where we don't walk very often. The further we got away from home, the more nervous he appeared, and he started pulling even harder on the leash to get home. I did all I could to reassure him, pointed out all the trees and fire hydrants that he could sniff, but he didn't seem to notice. I even had treats in my hand, and I was calling to let him know that I had a treat for him if he would slow down and walk next to me. But he didn't hear me calling. He was too focused on the fact that he wasn't comfortable in that neighborhood if bad were to happen. Myself getting really annoyed with him. And I raised my voice saying, "I'm right here. You don't need to be afraid. I'm not going to let anything bad happen to you." And then today's sermon topic, God. I wonder if God ever gets really annoyed with us when he's calling us to be in a new place or to do something that we're feeling unprepared for. We're too scared to even notice that God is next to us. Does God ever raise his voice at us saying, "I'm right here. Why don't you stop focusing on what's around you that is unfamiliar or doubting yourself and realize that I wouldn't bring you here if it wasn't safe? I'm calling you here for a reason." Our scripture story today continues with the story of Moses. River stream as an infant to save his life and was raised by an Egyptian princess. One day he went out to where the Hebrew slaves were working and he saw the forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and he killed the Egyptian. When the Pharaoh heard about this, Moses fled to the land of Midian and married the daughter of a shepherd. So Moses, who had been raised in wealth by an Egyptian princess, was now living the lowly life of a shepherd. He was tending his father-in-law's sheep near Mount Horeb, which was known as the Mountain of God, and where Moses later received the Ten Commandments. On this mountain, Moses encounters God. God appears in a burning bush that is not consumed by the fire. Only when Moses chooses to turn aside and look at this great sight does he hear God's call and recognize he is on holy ground. God expresses compassion for the Israelites. In Exodus 3, we read that God says of my people, "I have heard their cry. I know their suffering, and I have come to deliver them from the Egyptians." Moses must have been thrilled to hear that as a native Israelite himself. But here's the kicker. God then says, "So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of the land of Egypt." What? You're sending a lowly shepherd? Moses twice responds with serious doubts about fulfilling this calling. And in later verses, he tries to decline 3 more times. But God answers Moses' hesitations by assuring steadfast, divine faithfulness. And Moses is able to save the Israelites when he accepts the call from God. So the story of the burning bush seems like an amazing miracle. God talks to Moses from a burning bush that isn't consumed by fire. But what if burning bushes aren't as uncommon as we think? The rabbis of old say that others passed by the bush too, but it was Moses that turned aside, and that is when God spoke to him. Maybe the miracle isn't the burning bush, but the turning aside. Is there a burning bush that God is calling us to notice? What message does God have for us? The burning bush doesn't reveal God as the master of miracles. The burning bush reveals God's call, God's asking, God's insistence that God needs us. God is calling for us to make a response. Remember, Moses was a lowly shepherd for his father-in-law. He was in self-exile for killing an Egyptian guard. His life had become ordinary. Our lives may appear ordinary, with minimal significance in the world. However, when we are willing to turn our attention to the divine presence, when we stop and notice the burning bush, we realize that we too have important work to fulfill to help others. We may be called to start a new job, to take food to a neighbor, or to forgive someone. Or as Amanda said in her call to worship, we may be called to ask someone else to pray for forgiveness for someone because we're unable to. If you are tempted to hesitate, as we sometimes do when we hear God's call, the testimony I want you to hear today is God's reassurance that we do not journey alone because of God's awesome and steadfast faithfulness. I know that in my life, when I have turned aside and heard God call from the burning bush that is along the path, I have been blessed. I remember working on a sermon once on the topic of forgiveness, and God put a burning bush in my path that said, "You can't preach this sermon until you call your brother and ask forgiveness for the hardened heart you have for him and his new wife." That experience of asking and receiving has strengthened the relationship between me and my brother and sister-in-law, and given me a rich testimony of how freeing forgiveness can be. How does Moses know if he'll get it right? He doesn't. He doesn't know any more than we do. There will, however, be a sign. The sign, God says, will come after the people have been delivered, not before. It's as if God is saying, you'll look back on all this and see that I was there all along. And isn't that a pretty accurate description of our lives? We live life moving forward, uncertain but trusting, and we only begin to understand and make sense of it in retrospect. The message that I want you to hear this morning is meeting people, calling them, and moving them forward. As Rob Bell, a Christian author, says, when we are at F, God calls us to G. When we're at L, God calls us to M. And if we're way back at A, God meets us way back there at A and does what God always does, invites us forward to B. This is true for individuals, families, nations, and churches. We are being called by God throughout our life journey, not just when we're in a good place. So it's open for the burning bushes on our path. In the Bible, we find God ahead, confronting and calling people to a new vision of life together that still hasn't been fully realized, even though we've been working on it and trying for over 2,000 years. But God is still pulling us forward. I believe God is aware of the divisiveness of our nation, but God knows that this is not where it ends. God is still pulling us forward, calling us to the promise of harmony that is possible through Jesus Christ. The burning bushes are here in this day. We just need to pause and notice, and then listen to the call. There's another important point to this story. We read, "When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, 'Moses, Moses.' And he said, 'Here I am.' Then God said, 'Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." This is one of the most meaningful parts of this scripture for me, because he doesn't take his sandals off because just suddenly the ground has become holy. He takes his sandals off because he's just now realizing the ground has been holy the whole time. How many burning bushes would we see if we continued to remember that the ground we walk on has been holy the whole time? I was listening to NPR one day recently when I was driving to work, and I heard someone discussing what was called 6-word memoirs. In November of 2006, writer and editor Larry Smith issued a challenge to fans of his web publication, Smith Magazine. Inspired by Ernest Hemingway's short stories, Smith asked his readers to describe their lives in 6 words. The 6-word memoir contest officially ended after a month, but the stories kept coming. By 2011, participants had contributed more than 500,000 mini memoirs, and they continue to do so today. Here are some examples that contain a strong message. Finally, some hope on the horizon. Enjoy the journey, not the destination. Be kind. Find the humor. Love. My broken heart is now mended. I believe in things worth believing. In fact, even God realized the power of just a few words, as noted in some of the 10 Commandments. Honor thy father and thy mother. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. One of the most powerful spiritual experiences that I've had occurred at a spirituality retreat. We were asked to write a short prayer to God, something very similar to today's theme. God, what are you calling me to do? Then we were given time to meditate and write God's answer to us. I had never done this before. I was used to praying and then ending the prayer and then continuing to listen and hope for answers. But in this experience, we were asked to trust and to open our heart and our mind and to listen and write down God's answer to our prayer in that moment. Just grab a small piece of paper and a pen. We're going to take a few minutes to close our eyes, listen to some quiet music, and open our hearts and ask God, what are you calling me to do? Then we will listen for and write down God's 6 words for us. Try not to think of the words yourself. but simply listen to the music, quiet your mind, and open your heart. So our prayer will be, God, what are you calling me to do? So listen for the answer that God is telling you. Write God's 6-word memoir to you. It could be something like, be still, know that I'm God. Trust in me, I am here. Forgive as I have forgiven you. God's answer to you may not be what you expect, but I'd like us to take a few minutes during our worship together to ask God, where are you calling me? And then write the 6 words that God puts on your heart. So we're going to take that time now. Amy is going to share possibly a PowerPoint picture, but otherwise she'll be playing some meditative music for about 2.5 minutes for us to be able to share together. I hope that listening to God's 6 words for you was meaningful. When I was working on this sermon, I did this activity, and the 6 words that I heard in this burning bush moment was, take time for me, be still. That's what I needed to hear. So if you couldn't find the quiet time now, I'd encourage you to take some quiet time this week and listen for God's 6 words for you. And if you feel comfortable, send me your 6-word memoir, and I can put them together anonymously, share with everyone how God is speaking to us as a community, individually. Because I believe we are strengthened when we hear how God is working in each other's lives. And what better way than by sharing God's answer to our prayer. To close, I'd like to share an experience from Rob Bell's book, What We Talk About When We Talk About God. Rob Bell is from California, and he's a surfer, and these are his words. One morning recently, I was surfing just after sunrise, and there was only one other surfer out. In between sets, he and I started talking. He told me about his work and his family, and then after about an hour in the water together, he told me how he'd been an alcoholic and a drug addict and an atheist. And then he'd gotten clean and sober and found God in the process. As he sat there floating on his board next to me, with not a cloud in the sky and the surface of the water like glass, he looked around and said, "And now I see God everywhere." We will be sharing in a meditative video next, and this is from a song that I heard a few weeks ago. And it really touched my heart. I actually sent it to a few people and said, this is a really meaningful song, and I think it speaks to what we're talking about today. And these are some of the words that you're going to hear. I'm standing at your door. My heart is calling yours. Come fall into my arms. I'm reaching out. I'll chase you down. I dare you to believe how much I love you. I am your strength. We'll be walking on the water, dancing on the waves. Pay attention to the burning bushes in your life. What or who is God calling you to notice? When you turn aside and notice God's burning bush that is burning with a message for you, that is when you will meet the divine. And when you meet the divine and open your heart, you will hear God's call to you. May you be blessed on your journey.